Hello everybody, Brandon here, and welcome to a new video. Today we're going to be covering one of my favorite openings of all time, and that's the King's Indian defense. What is the King's Indian defense? Well, before we even look at the moves, it's probably good to know who it's played by. Some of the famous examples are Bobby Fischer and Kasparov. So if those two players are people you know and people you would like to model your game after, then this is definitely the opening for you. How do we get to it though? So when we play the King's Indian defense, it will normally rise after d4. It can also transpose from c4. Both moves you can just play the move knight to f6. And after c4, which they do to grab more of the center, you play the move g6. Knight to c3 to try to get e4 in. Now you could go to the Benoni, or sorry, not the Benoni. You go into the Grunfeld with the move d5, but that's not what we're doing today. We are looking at bishop to g7, e4, d6, knight to f3, and castles. This is the normal variation of the King's Indian, and essentially what that means is you will get into the classical main lines. There are other things that can happen in the King's Indian, of course. Your opponent can play a London system, or your opponent could play some sort of f3 or f4 setup, which is actually just as good. It's the same thing with something like h3. They can try to play something a little off. This is called the Macagano System. Maybe we'll cover this a different day. However, it's probably best to cover the classical mainlines first, and that's what we have here. So now, we're at a crossroads. After the move bishop to e2, white's going to castle, and white has a significant amount of space. So what do we do in this position? Funnily enough, black has the move e5, and this is very important to know. Why does this work though? Because when we see e5, we actually notice that this pawn is under attack twice, and it's only defended once. But there is a tactic which saves the game here. So if takes, and the knight takes on e5, there's always this knight takes e4 counter sacrifice attacking the knight on e5. And, well, we capture their pawn in time, so we're actually okay here. So, of course, that's not necessarily the most challenging way to continue. Of course, the exchange variation of the King's Indian is a very challenging way to play still. If we go instead and look at this position after e5, probably what you're most likely to see is the move d5 or the move castles, followed by a future d5. Of course, you could transpose into or go into some weird Maroczy-like structure where you have a c7 pawn instead of an e7 pawn, and that's an okay way to play as well, but we're not looking at that today either. We're looking at the classical setup. And how do we get the classical setup here? We play the move knight to c6. So after knight to c6, white usually will respond with the move d5, as now we do have potential threats of just taking on d4. We don't win a pawn or anything, but it might be a nice move to get in. And after d5 and knight to e7, there's something happening here. This is the essentially the tabia of the King's Indian classical variation. And of course, I just want to mention here that if d5, there is slightly different ways to play, as your knight's not on e7. You can play the move a5 and try to bring your knight to the c5 square and try to grip that square. Or you can play a knight to d7. But of course, in the main line, which is after knight to e7, there's a lot of setups that white can go for, and they all revolve mainly around the same idea. What's that idea? So we have to look at the pawn structure here to understand what's going on and where both sides want to direct their play moving forward. As we can see, black has their pawns facing the king side, and this is actually a good way to come up with plans in a position if you're stuck. Look at the base of your pawn chain. The base means the thing that's not protected. And then look at the head of the chain and draw an arrow. And generally, when you draw an arrow, you'll actually see a direction in which you should face and attack. And as we can see here, black stands better slightly on the king side and would prefer to attack over there, as well, all their pieces are on that side as well. The bishop, although on the queen side, it does face the king side mainly. And watch out, this bishop may not move for the entire game, but it's a very strong piece. And also, we want to go for the f5 break. But before we talk more about that, we should also talk about what white's plans are too, because, well, it's not just our game, it's white's game too. And, well, we're going to have to deal with our opponents trying to beat us. So white's plans generally revolve around the c5 break. This is the classical way to play. And this is why you'll see the very common move knight to e1. It looks strange, but the idea is to reroute to d3 and go for c5. This is very important to know. Now, of course, there's not just knight to e1. Other moves are knight to d2, as well as the move b4, which is the bayonet attack. But most of these lines have the same principles, where c5 is something that they're going for, and you can generally play with the same approach each time. For example, if knight to e1, what we can do here is play knight to d7, a very strange looking move, which feels like we're just moving the same piece twice in the opening. But the whole point is we're going for f5 and potentially f4. So let's just look at a sample line of how the game may continue. And this is very, very common as to what could happen. Knight to d3, f5. You could see something like f3 and then f4. In fact, knight to d3 immediately isn't as great because bishop e3 is more common, with the same idea of f4, bishop f2, and then g5, where, again, the c5 move will eventually be played, for example, like a knight to d3, and we're going to re-maneuver our pieces back to the other side of the board, the king side, and go for a g4 break. And, if needed, we can play g3 and sometimes sacrifice our bishop on h3 if possible, though that should be done with care. But that's a lot of information, and, well, I don't expect you to remember all of it, but the important plans to break things down, instead of looking at all these crazy sample lines, and you might see something like this in your games if you're playing against someone that also knows these positions well, is again, you want to go for this f5 break, and it revolves around controlling your fair share of the center and creating space on the side where you have an advantage. And of course, black has an advantage on the king side, so they want to increase their space on the king side. White is doing the same. They want to play c5 and create space on the queen side, which they stand better if you just look at this pawn chain. You could also argue that it does face the king side as well, which is the argument of that h3 system that we looked at a while ago. But again, you will mainly see players go for the c5 break. Now, we could continue talking about all of the theory that's going on here. Instead, I thought it would be cool to look at a sample game and talk less about the intricacies of that game and talk about more specific maneuvers you might see when you play the classical King's Indian setups. So let's get into that. Okay, and now we are looking at a game between Kamsky and Garry Kasparov, who's playing with the black pieces. And we're going to go back over the moves. So we see d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, and bishop to g7, d6, castles, and now we have, again, this tabia position of bishop to e2 and e5. Again, e5, watch out. You might think you can take it. You can take once, but taking again isn't so great because you can always counter-sacrifice on e4 with a discovered attack against the knight on e5. So instead, of course, white just castles because they know that trick. They're a grandmaster. Knight to c6, trying to influence the center and provoke d5. d5 is played. And knight to e7. Here we see the move knight to d2, not knight to e1. But this does have a similar idea in mind with the knight e1 or the b4 systems. The only difference is where the knight will end up. Instead of the knight ending up on d3, they want to put the knight on c4. And we'll see why in a little bit. So knight to e8, and again, knight to e8 is played because of the move f5. Rook to b1, going for b4 to help get the c5 move in. f5, b4, knight back to f6. Again, it's done its job, so it just returns to where it was. It wanted to move out of the way so the f-pawn could advance. We see f3, and now f4. And there's actually a little minute thing to note here. This is very, in my opinion, unimportant, but it's a little nuanced. Usually you only play f4 when f3 has also been played. So that's just something to keep in mind, although that's not super duper important. Now we see c5, and the idea of the knight on d2 finally comes to fruition. It wants to go to the c4 square, and after taking on d6, this d6 pawn will be weak. That is the big thing to attack in this position for white. Not only that, They also might want to bring their knight to b5 and attack the weak c7 square, which is why we're going to see some maneuvers that try to fight against both of these ideas. Now we see g5, and this was discussed before with the idea of going for a g4 break. Knight to c4, and now again they're readying an attack essentially against the d6 pawn. Knight to g6, getting out of the way of the e7 square, and we'll see why that's going to be important in a second. And also just bringing another piece closer to the king side. That's going to be very important. a4, and now we see one of the cool maneuvers that you can almost always, I don't want to be too certain, I don't want to say that these things are always going to be playable, because you're going to always find exceptions too. But this is one of those moves that it's relatively safe to throw in when you're in a position like this. And that's the move Rook to f7. This looks strange, but there's two ideas behind it. Actually, maybe three. And the first idea is to cover the c7 square. The c7 square is, again, a weakness. For example, with knight to b5 as a potential move in the future, we can see a knight landing on c7. And since we mentioned that this bishop on c8 is a very strong piece, which can usually sacrifice, it's usually very, very bad for us to lose this piece. This is probably the most important minor piece in our position for the entire game, even if we don't move it, which is kind of funny to think about. So this covers the c7 squares and prevents any infiltrations on b5 to c7. Also, there's two more ideas. Now we will see the second one in just one move. After bishop to a3, now we see bishop to f8. Okay, that's interesting. So the rook moved up to not only cover the 7th rank, specifically the c7 square, but also to allow the bishop to retreat to f8 and cover the weakness on d6. That's, in my opinion, a very powerful idea that's both defensive and will be more offensive in nature as we continue the game. a5, and now we see the third reason 3 times in a row of why this rook f7 move is good. Now we see the move rook to g7. This is not just a defensive piece on c7. It's actually an offensive piece too, which can help coordinate a g4 break against the king on g1. And this rook becomes a very important attacker in the entirety of the game. We see b5 and b6 as just a defensive move. Generally be careful about making moves on the queen side, because this is the side you're worse. Unless you know the move works out for you, it feels like you might be wasting time. Of course, this is Kasparov. He knows when to make defensive moves work. C takes d6, c takes d6, and again we see the power of this bishop being on f8 now, because this pawn would have just been hanging in the end, but instead it is not. Knight to a2, and the idea is to potentially maneuver to c6, which is a weak square in black's position, and again that's one of the problems with making moves on that side of the board. You create weaknesses. If b6 wasn't played, c6 wouldn't be weak, but of course Kasparov had ideas in mind. g4. Going on the offensive now, getting that break in. After takes, of course, this looks like, yeah, just the pawn was lost and sacrificed, but there's a good reason why. The move knight to h4 comes in the board now. And, well, they're ready to capture on g4 now. And any other move, for example, like g3, feels very, very incorrect. For example, the move f3 immediately comes to mind. However, there is also the move knight takes g4, I believe, where after, for example, let's just say bishop takes g4, which is not a good move. There's bishop takes g4, and then there's always knight to f3 check in the air. So you're not actually losing a piece. And of course, when g3 happens, you're moving pawns on the wrong side of the board. You can always consider taking the pawn after a few moves as well. But that was not played because, again, these are grandmasters. They're not making simple blunders. Rook to b3. This is an offensive and defensive idea. It's to double up on the c file, but also to protect the third rank against any f3 breaks, just in case if they happen. Knight takes g4. Bishop to f3, trying to just defend everything. B takes a5. Hey, a free pawn's a free pawn. Queen to d2. a4, just attacking the rook and trying to make it a little bit more awkward here. Rook to c3. Bishop to d7. Again, this piece is very important, and also this is now attacking the b5 pawn with tempo, so it's always a nice move to be able to throw in. Rook to b1 is somewhat forced because the pawn does have to be defended. Now Rook C8, activating the last piece. Sometimes you don't even activate that A8 rook. You just use every other piece, but this bishop and this rook, and, well, you end up just mating. But that's, of course, not what Kasparov does. He includes every piece because, again, I can say it every day, all day long. He's a grandmaster. He tries to use all of his pieces in the attack. King to h1, and now a crazy, crazy move. Knight takes h2. And we're not going to get into the complications because that's not what this video is about. If you would like me to cover this more in depth, then I can consider doing that on Mondays where we cover master games. However, we're covering openings today, and we want to see how black just increases their edge by making natural maneuvers and then just sacrifices and breaks through in seemingly equal positions or slightly better positions. However, this position is a train wreck, and it looks like black should just be winning here. And in fact, black is. So king takes h2. Rook takes c4 now. So sacrifice the piece, and now sacrifices in exchange. But with the idea that if rook takes, now there's knight takes f3, winning the queen, because if takes, there's queen to h4, checkmate. So rook b to c1. The knight was actually undefended because it couldn't be taken. And since it couldn't be taken, well, Kasparov did just win a pawn in that instance with taking on h2, as we can see, because taking on c4 was just possible. After rook b to c1, we see knight takes f3 check, rook takes f3, and after queen to h4 check, unfortunately, rook h3 is not possible because, well, that kind of just ends the game, doesn't it? Because now there's threats of just taking on g2 or just moving away. Either way, this is just going to be completely winning. But of course, they're grandmasters. They try to play a little bit trickier. King to g1, rook takes e4, taking another pawn. Queen to f2, trying to go for a trade because, well, if they can get a trade, maybe they can hold the position. And, well, when you're attacking, keep queens on the board. And that's what Kasparov does. Queen to h5, rook c7. Again, we see the c7 square come into play, although it's a little too late, unfortunately. Rook to e1 check. Which is a beautiful way to essentially end the game. And the queen is forced to take it. And after queen takes f3, threatening to take on g2. Or after queen to d2, queen to g4, threatening f3, knight to c3, now f3, rook takes a7, and queen to h3 to end the game. Of course, I will leave the PGN link in the description so you can go at this game a bit deeper if you'd like to, but the important things to cover are, well, when you play this e5 and knight c6 all the way at the start, which is the classical King's Indian defense, what you're going to notice is you have more space on the king side, play on the king side. Play for f5. If you need to, play f4 and go for this g4 break. And also, try not to make many moves on the queen side. If we look at this entire game, how many queenside moves did black really play, right? So this game was 37 moves long. There were a few recaptures. There was one b6 move, that was about it. And they took the pawn and pushed it. They played a little bit with the rooks, but mainly, as we can see, it felt like all of the play was directed on the king side here, and there was just no hope for white because white just couldn't defend the threats, and that was the game. So I hope you did enjoy, and I hope you learned something about the King's Indian defense from this lesson. There's a lot to know about this opening. It gets super in depth, but it's fun, and knowing these basic ideas, I truly believe will help you get started in playing it correctly. Thank you for watching, and I will see you guys next week for a new opening analysis video. And just as a reminder, if we hit 1,000 subscribers, I will do a 10-hour game coverage of the Berlin Endgame and cover that opening exhaustively. If you want to make me depressed, well, more depressed, I think is fair to say, then yeah, hit the subscribe button, and thank you for watching. Have a good one. Good one? Have a good one. Bye-bye.